When he first moved into the quiet neighborhood by the lake, everything felt peaceful. The streets were clean, the lawns were trimmed like green carpets, and the air smelled of pine and fresh water. It seemed like the perfect place to start fresh, a calm escape from the noise of city life. He wasn't looking for trouble. All he wanted was a little space where he could relax, fish on weekends, and enjoy the view from his backyard. He had saved for years to buy this house. It wasn't huge or fancy, but it had one thing that meant the world to him: a view of the lake that shimmered like glass in the mornings. Right after moving in, he brought his small fishing boat with him. It wasn't a big yacht or anything expensive, just an old, reliable boat he'd used for years to fish with his father. The paint was faded, but it was clean and well kept. He parked it neatly beside the garage, covered it with a blue tarp, and thought nothing of it. For the first few weeks, life there was good. He greeted neighbors with a smile, waved when cars passed by, and even helped the older couple next door carry groceries once. Everyone seemed friendly. Kids played on the sidewalks, dogs barked in the distance, and the lake sparkled behind the houses like a shared secret. Then one morning, he noticed something strange in his mailbox: a white envelope stamped with the logo of the Homeowners Association, or HOA. Inside was a letter that looked serious. It said he was violating community appearance rules because of an unauthorized recreational vehicle parked in plain sight. He blinked at the words, reading them twice. Unauthorized recreational vehicle? They meant his boat. At first he laughed it off, thinking it must be a mistake. Surely no one could have a problem with a small fishing boat sitting on his driveway. But 2 days later, another letter arrived, this one more formal. It stated that if he didn't remove the boat within 10 days, he'd be fined. That's when he realized they were serious. He decided to attend the next HOA meeting to talk things out. The meeting was held in a small community hall near the lake. About 15 people were there, mostly neighbors, sitting in folding chairs and sipping coffee. At the front table sat 3 board members, all wearing polite smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. When it was his turn to speak, he stood up calmly and explained that the boat was parked neatly, covered, and not blocking anyone's view. One of the board members cleared her throat and said, "We understand, but the rules clearly state that boats, trailers, and RVs cannot be visible from the street." He tried to reason with them. He explained that he used the boat often and that moving it every week would be a hassle. He even offered to build a small fence to keep it out of sight. But they shook their heads. "Rules are rules," they said. "If we make one exception, we have to make them for everyone." He left the meeting frustrated. It wasn't the rule itself that bothered him. It was how rigid and unfriendly they were about it. He'd just moved in, had done nothing wrong, and already they were treating him like a problem. The following week, another letter arrived. This time it included a fine of $200. That's when things began to change inside him. He wasn't a confrontational person, but he also wasn't someone who liked being pushed around. He decided he wasn't going to give in so easily. He started paying closer attention to how things worked around the neighborhood. He noticed that some homeowners had their own small violations: garden statues, unapproved paint colors, or patio furniture visible from the road. But somehow, no one seemed to bother them. It felt personal now, like the HOA had picked him as their target just because he was new. Still, he didn't want to make enemies. He tried sending polite emails, attaching pictures of how clean and tidy his property looked. He explained again that the boat was in good shape and wasn't hurting the neighborhood's appearance. The HOA replied with a short message: "Regulations must be followed by all residents." No sympathy, no discussion, just cold words typed in a formal tone. He sighed and looked out at the lake behind his home. That water had been one of the main reasons he'd bought the property. He loved fishing early in the morning when the mist floated above the surface. It brought him peace, reminded him of his father, and gave him a reason to slow down and breathe. Every time he saw that view, the frustration faded a little, but it always came back when he saw those envelopes in his mailbox. Weeks went by, and the tension grew. Some neighbors began whispering about the boat situation. A few of them quietly told him they thought the HOA was being unfair. One man down the street said, "They just like control. Don't let them bully you." That small bit of support meant a lot. He didn't want to turn this into a neighborhood war, but he also couldn't accept being treated unjustly. So he decided to do some research. He spent a few nights reading through the HOA bylaws and property documents. The rules were full of legal words, but he took his time highlighting things that stood out. Then, while looking at the property map, he noticed something that made him pause. The lake wasn't fully owned by the HOA. In fact, according to the old records, the portion behind his house was deeded as private property. His property. He leaned back in his chair, reading the lines again just to be sure. It was there in black and white. The HOA might control the streets and sidewalks, but the slice of land touching the lake behind his backyard was not theirs. It belonged to him. And if that was true, it meant something very interesting, something the HOA probably didn't even know. Because on weekends, several of those same HOA board members were often out there fishing. He'd seen them from his window, sitting by the water with their rods and coolers, laughing as if they owned the place. They'd even told him once that everyone in the community has access to the lake. But if the papers were right, that wasn't true. He closed the file with a quiet smile. For the first time since the letters began, he didn't feel angry. He felt patient. He knew now that he didn't have to argue or shout to make a point. Sometimes the best revenge wasn't loud. It was calm, quiet, and backed by facts. He looked out the window again that evening. The sun was dipping low, painting the lake in orange and gold. His little boat sat right where it always had, covered and peaceful. The HOA could keep sending letters if they wanted. He wasn't going anywhere. Not yet. Because deep down, he knew something they didn't. And soon enough, they were going to find out exactly who they were dealing with. After that day, he stopped replying to the HOA letters, not out of carelessness, but because he had realized something important. Reacting to every word they said was exactly what they wanted. They wanted control. They wanted him to get frustrated and give in. Instead, he chose silence. And in that silence, he started planning. Every few days, he would still get envelopes in the mail. Warnings, reminders, even threats of legal action. He read them calmly, then placed them in a neat pile on his desk. He didn't throw them away. He was keeping a record just in case. His tone stayed polite whenever he ran into anyone from the HOA. He still waved, still smiled. To anyone watching, it looked like he'd given up. But inside, he was quietly waiting. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood carried on as usual. The air was full of the smell of fresh-cut grass and barbecues. Children rode their bikes past his driveway and dogs barked from fenced yards. He tried to stay focused on the things he loved. Early mornings, he'd make himself a cup of coffee and stand by the window, watching the mist rise over the lake. The calmness of the water always helped him think. That's when he started noticing how often people came to fish. At first, it didn't bother him. It was a public-looking lake after all. But then, he remembered what he had found in those property documents. The boundary line was clear. The lake access point behind his backyard was private land belonging to him. The HOA had no legal claim over it, yet nearly every weekend, the same group of board members came out there with their fishing rods, coolers, and lawn chairs. They'd laugh and chat for hours, their cars parked in the community lot nearby. He found the irony almost amusing. The same people who called his clean-covered boat a community violation were sitting right there on land they didn't own. The thought made him shake his head. He didn't say a word. Not yet. One Saturday afternoon, he was trimming his bushes when he saw one of the HOA members, the same man who'd signed several of the warning letters, walking toward the lake, carrying a fishing rod. The man nodded at him politely as if nothing had ever happened. "Nice day for fishing," the man said. "Sure is," he replied with a smile. He wanted to say more, but didn't. Instead, he watched as the man settled near the water's edge right behind his property line. That evening, he went back inside, pulled out the deed papers, and smiled again. It was time to dig a little deeper. Over the next week, he visited the local property office. He asked for a detailed map of the community and all lake access rights. The staff were friendly and confirmed everything he already suspected. The HOA had no ownership over that section of the lake. It was privately deeded land. In other words, everyone who had been fishing there without permission had technically been trespassing. When he got home that evening, he sat at his kitchen table looking at the papers. He didn't want revenge. That wasn't his nature, but he wanted fairness. He had been treated like a rule breaker for something harmless, while the very people enforcing those rules were breaking them themselves. Instead of reacting out of anger, he came up with a plan that was clever but calm. He didn't tell anyone. He simply waited for the right opportunity. The next weekend arrived, and with it, the familiar sounds of laughter and chatter from the lake. The HOA members had gathered again, fishing poles in hand. He could hear them from his backyard, talking loudly about neighborhood issues, even discussing more appearance violations they planned to address. The irony made him smile again. He decided to walk down to the dock. His steps were steady, his expression friendly. The group looked up when they saw him coming. "Afternoon," he said cheerfully. They greeted him back, though some looked slightly uneasy, probably remembering the ongoing boat issue. He stood beside them for a moment, glancing at the water. "Beautiful day," he said. "You guys come out here often?" One of them chuckled. "Every weekend if we can." "The lake's one of the best things about living here." He nodded slowly. "It is. You know, I was just looking at the property lines the other day," he said casually. "Did you know this section of the shore is actually on my deed?" They paused. A few exchanged confused looks. The man holding the fishing rod frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "The HOA maintains this lake." He smiled politely. "That's true for most of it, but not here. This part behind my lot, it's privately owned. It's right there on the county map." The group fell silent. No one spoke for a moment. Finally, one of them muttered, "Oh, we didn't realize that." He nodded, keeping his tone light. "No worries. I'm not saying you can't enjoy it, but since we're talking about following rules," he said gently, "I just thought you'd want to make sure everything's done properly." It was a short conversation, but the message was clear. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He just stated the truth calmly and firmly. Then he turned and walked back toward his house, leaving them to sit there in awkward silence. Later that evening, he saw them packing up earlier than usual. Their laughter was gone, replaced with quiet murmurs. He didn't feel smug about it, just satisfied. For the first time, he felt like the balance was starting to shift. Over the next few days, he noticed something interesting. The HOA stopped sending letters. The usual monthly reminder about community standards didn't show up. No one knocked on his door. It was as if they had suddenly decided to leave him alone, but he knew it wasn't over. People like that rarely admit defeat. They would try to find another way to assert control. So he kept his records, stayed calm, and went about his days as usual. Each morning, he still made his coffee and stood by the window watching the lake. It looked peaceful, reflecting the pink light of sunrise. He thought about how strange it was that something so simple, a small fishing boat, had turned into such a big problem. He had learned something valuable through all of it. When people try to control you unfairly, the best way to fight back isn't through anger or shouting. It's through patience, knowledge, and quiet confidence. And deep down, he sensed that this story wasn't finished yet. The HOA had backed off for now, but soon enough, something would bring them back to his doorstep. He didn't know what it would be, but when it happened, he'd be ready to us with a calm smile, a folder of proof, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing the lake behind his house gave him more power than any of their rulebooks ever could. After that quiet exchange by the lake, things in the neighborhood seemed to calm down. Weeks passed without a single letter from the HOA. For the first time since he had moved in, his mailbox was free of warnings and fines. It was almost peaceful again. He spent his mornings like he always did, sitting on his porch with a warm cup of coffee, watching the sunlight spread over the water. The lake looked like glass, perfectly still, as if it carried no memory of the tension that had surrounded it. But he knew the peace wouldn't last forever. The HOA had gone silent, but silence didn't mean surrender. It usually meant they were planning something. He didn't like assuming the worst, but after what he'd been through, he had learned how some people worked. They didn't like being proven wrong, especially in public. A few neighbors began to notice, too. One evening, as he was pulling weeds near the driveway, an older man from 2 houses down walked over and said, "You handled that situation pretty smartly. The board hasn't been so quiet in years." He smiled. "I just wanted to be treated fairly." The neighbor nodded. "That's the problem with them. They don't know how to back off. You watch, they'll try something new soon." And he was right. A couple of weeks later, another envelope arrived in the mail. It wasn't about the boat this time. Instead, it mentioned community lake access maintenance fees. It claimed that all homeowners near the lake had to pay extra for the upkeep of shared areas. He read the letter twice, then laughed softly to himself. The irony was almost funny now. The HOA was trying to collect fees for maintaining something they didn't even own. He didn't get angry. He simply made a copy of his property deed and attached a short note that said, "Thank you for your concern, but this portion of the lake is privately owned. I maintain it myself." Then he mailed it back to them, that was all. No arguments, no long explanations, just facts. After that, he didn't hear back for a while. It was clear the HOA didn't know what to do next. Some of them avoided eye contact when they saw him around. Others tried to act overly friendly, offering awkward smiles when they passed by on their evening walks. He stayed polite but distant. He wasn't looking for a fight. He just wanted to live peacefully, take care of his home, and enjoy the little things that made life good, like fishing, sunsets, and the quiet hum of crickets at night. Then came summer, and the lake became the center of the neighborhood's life again. Kids played near the water, families had picnics, and yes, the HOA board members were back with their fishing gear. They set up their folding chairs just like before, as if nothing had changed. He didn't say anything that first weekend. He just watched from his porch, calm and silent. But the second weekend, when they showed up again, he decided it was time to remind them of something. He walked down to the edge of the yard, where one of the board members was setting up his fishing line. "Afternoon," he said kindly. "Hey there." The man replied quickly, his tone cheerful but nervous. He smiled politely. "I just wanted to remind you that this part of the lake is on my property. You're welcome to fish here, but from now on, I'd appreciate if you asked first." The man looked startled for a moment, then nodded quickly. "Oh, of course. Sure, no problem. I didn't realize you were particular about it." He chuckled softly. "It's not about being particular. It's about respect. I take care of this area myself, so I just want to make sure people understand that." "Got it," the man said, looking embarrassed. He reeled in his line and packed up quietly. After that day, the fishing visits slowed down. A few still came, but they'd wave first or call out from the edge of the yard asking, "Mind if we fish for a bit?" And each time he'd say, "Go ahead, just respect the space." Word started spreading across the neighborhood. People began to see him differently. He wasn't the guy with the boat problem anymore. Now he was the calm, clever homeowner who stood up to the HOA without ever raising his voice. Even some who had once sided with the HOA began to admire how he handled things. They'd stop by to chat about the lake, ask for tips on fishing, or compliment how nice his yard looked. Slowly, the mood around him began to shift. Still, the HOA wasn't happy. Losing that small sense of control over him seemed to bother them deeply. At their next meeting, they tried to rewrite some of the neighborhood rules, probably in hopes of making him comply somehow. But every time they brought up a new rule, someone in the room would quietly ask, "Are we even allowed to do that after what happened with the lake?" He never attended those meetings again. He didn't need to. His point had already been made, but there was one moment that made him smile more than any other. Late one evening, just after sunset, he heard footsteps near the water. He walked out quietly and saw two of the HOA board members standing there, fishing rods in hand. When they saw him, they froze like kids caught doing something wrong. He just grinned. "Evening," he said. "You boys got your permission slips this time?" They both laughed awkwardly. "We were hoping you'd say yes," one of them said. He nodded. "Sure, just don't leave any trash behind." They thanked him and went back to fishing. He stood there for a moment watching them, then turned and walked back toward his porch, smiling to himself. Life had a funny way of balancing things out. The same people who had once written him letters about community image were now asking for his permission to fish on his property. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about fairness and quiet dignity. The best part was he hadn't needed lawyers, arguments, or drama. All he'd needed was patience, a little knowledge, and the courage to stand his ground politely. As the months passed, his boat stayed right where it was, beside the garage, shining under the afternoon sun. Nobody complained anymore. The HOA still sent newsletters and updates, but his name never appeared in them again. Sometimes he'd sit on his dock, a fishing rod in hand, listening to the gentle ripple of water and the soft buzz of summer insects. That sound, that peace, it reminded him why he'd moved here in the first place. And though the battle with the HOA had started over something small, it had ended up teaching him something much bigger. Sometimes the best way to win is not by fighting harder, but by staying calm when others lose their balance. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. The lake, the boat, and the peace in his heart said everything for him. As summer moved toward autumn, the neighborhood started to quiet down again. The days grew shorter, the air cooler, and the lake began to reflect shades of orange and gold. Life felt peaceful for once. His boat sat exactly where it had always been, covered neatly beside the garage, untouched and unbothered. For the first time in months, he could walk to his mailbox without that knot of frustration in his chest. But even in peace, he stayed cautious. He knew how the HOA worked. Quiet didn't always mean calm. Sometimes it just meant they were waiting for a chance to stir things up again. One Saturday morning, as he was sweeping leaves from the porch, a white SUV slowed down in front of his house. He looked up to see one of the HOA board members rolling down the window with a practiced smile. "Morning," she said, her voice polite but tight. "We're organizing a neighborhood event next month. A lake cleanup day. We'd love for you to participate." He smiled back. "Sure. I already take care of my part of the lake every week, but I'll be happy to help." Her smile faltered for a second, just enough for him to notice. She nodded quickly, then drove off. Later that afternoon, a letter appeared in his mailbox, again with the HOA's logo. This one wasn't about a violation, but it asked for temporary access rights to his part of the lake during the cleanup event. He couldn't help but laugh. They wanted his permission now. He sat at the kitchen table, reading the letter slowly. It felt strange seeing them ask so formally, especially after all the trouble they had given him about that boat. He didn't plan to be petty, but he also wasn't going to let them walk over him again. He wrote a simple reply. Permission granted for cleanup purposes only, under supervision, and with respect for private property boundaries. He signed it, made a copy for his records, and mailed it back the same day. A week later, the HOA started preparing for the event. Flyers were posted on the notice board. Neighbors talked about it while walking their dogs, and a few volunteers even stopped by to thank him for allowing access. Most people were kind and genuine. They weren't the problem. It had always been the board's attitude. When the cleanup day arrived, the neighborhood came alive early in the morning. People showed up in gloves and boots, carrying trash bags and nets.
Kids ran around excitedly, pretending to be on an adventure.
He stood by the dock, ready to help, enjoying the buzz of community spirit. The HOA president was there too, trying hard to act friendly. She walked over with a clipboard and said, "Thanks for letting us use your part of the lake. It means a lot to the community," he nodded. "No problem at all. I just want everyone to enjoy it safely." For a while, everything went smoothly. People picked up litter, pulled weeds, and cleared out fallen branches. He worked alongside them quietly, helping wherever he could. It felt good to see everyone pitching in together. Then something happened that changed the tone of the day. One of the board members, the same man who used to complain the most about his boat, walked up to the side of his garage and frowned. "You know," he said loud enough for others to hear, "if you parked that boat somewhere else, the street would look even better." The words hung in the air. A few people nearby stopped what they were doing. He turned slowly, wiping his hands on his gloves, and looked at the man with calm eyes. "I think the street looks just fine," he said softly, "and so does the boat. It's clean, covered, and fully within my rights to park it here." The man smirked. "Rules are rules, you know," he smiled faintly. "Yes, they are. And you should remember them when you're fishing on private property." The board member's face turned red, and for a moment no one said a word. Then a neighbor nearby chuckled quietly, and others followed with small smiles. The tension broke. The man quickly muttered something and walked away, pretending to check the water instead. He didn't feel triumphant, just relieved. The whole situation had once made him angry, but now it only made him tired. He didn't enjoy confrontation. All he'd ever wanted was fairness. After the cleanup ended, people thanked him again for letting them use the space. Some even brought snacks and drinks to share. As the sun dipped low over the lake, the water shimmered like it was made of gold. The mood was peaceful again, and everyone seemed to forget about the brief awkward moment earlier. That evening, as he sat on his porch, he thought about how much had changed. The same lake that had once been a point of conflict was now something everyone could enjoy, but only because he had stood his ground. He realized that sometimes standing up for yourself doesn't just change how people treat you, it changes how they see you. Over the next few weeks, things continued to improve. The HOA barely contacted him anymore. The board seemed to have learned that he wasn't someone they could push around. The letters stopped completely, and when he passed them in the street, they offered polite nods. He also noticed something else. The neighborhood had become friendlier. People smiled more, waved more, and small conversations popped up between houses. Maybe his situation had reminded others that kindness and respect mattered more than power or rules. One afternoon, while he was fixing the dock, a family stopped by with a small cooler. "Mind if we fish for a while?" they asked politely. "Go ahead," he said with a smile. "Just be sure to leave the spot as clean as you found it." They promised they would. As he watched them fish quietly, laughter echoing across the water, he felt content. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about finding peace after a long stretch of unfairness. But even then, a small thought lingered in the back of his mind. He knew the HOA wouldn't stay quiet forever. Sooner or later, something else would come up. Maybe another rule, maybe another complaint. But this time he was ready. He had learned to stay calm, stay smart, and keep everything documented. He had also learned that sometimes the best way to fight unfair rules is not to fight loudly, but to stand quietly and let truth speak for itself. That night, as he covered the boat before heading inside, he paused for a moment. The air was cool, the stars bright above the still lake. He smiled to himself. The same boat that had caused him so much trouble now sat as a quiet symbol of strength, a reminder that peace doesn't come from giving in, but from knowing when to stand firm. And deep down, he had a feeling that the next chapter of this story was about to be even more interesting, because when people who crave control realize they've lost it, they always try to take it back. But this time, he wasn't the newcomer anymore. He was the one they'd have to ask for permission. Weeks passed, and the quiet life around the lake returned. The sound of crickets at night, the soft rustle of leaves in the wind, and the gentle waves brushing against the dock became part of his everyday peace. He finally felt that the storm with the HOA had settled for good. But peace, he had learned, never lasted long when there was an HOA involved. It started with a rumor. One evening, while walking his dog, a neighbor stopped him near the mailbox. "Hey," the man said quietly, "you might want to check the new HOA meeting notes. There's talk about new regulations for lake access." He raised an eyebrow. "Regulations? For the lake?" The neighbor nodded. "Something about setting new rules for fishing and boating. I'm not sure what exactly, but it sounds like they're trying to tighten control again." He thanked the man and walked home slowly, deep in thought. He wasn't surprised. The HOA board had gone silent for a while, but he could almost feel that they were itching to take back control of the situation. Later that night, he logged into the community portal and found the meeting agenda. Sure enough, there it was. Proposal to revise lake access policies. He read through it carefully. They wanted to standardize lake use, which meant any activity, fishing, boating, or even walking near the private dock, would require HOA approval. But the lake was not entirely HOA property. A portion of it, including the dock area, was privately owned by him. They couldn't legally control it. He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. It seemed they hadn't learned much after all. The next morning, he decided to attend the upcoming HOA meeting. He printed out his property documents, along with the past correspondence showing their earlier mistake about his boat. This time, he was ready for whatever they tried to pull. The meeting took place in the clubhouse, the same place where, months earlier, they had accused him of violating rules. As he walked in, the room fell a little quiet. A few neighbors nodded politely. Some whispered, and the board members exchanged glances. The president started the meeting, going through the agenda quickly. When she reached the lake access topic, her tone became more careful. "We believe, as a community, it's important to manage lake use responsibly. This includes setting uniform standards for fishing, boating, and maintenance." He raised his hand calmly. "May I ask a question before you proceed?" She hesitated. "Of course. Is this policy meant to apply to all parts of the lake or only to those areas owned and maintained by the HOA? A long pause followed. One of the board members cleared his throat. "Well, ideally to all of it. That way, it's consistent for everyone." He nodded slowly. "But that would mean trying to regulate private property, correct? Because a portion of the lake, that including my dock, is not HOA land. I have the property deeds to prove it." He placed the documents neatly on the table in front of them. The room went silent again. The president leaned forward, glancing at the papers, then looked back at him. Yes, she said carefully, but it would be nice to have one system. For unity, he smiled slightly. Unity is a good thing, but forcing control over something that doesn't belong to you, that's not unity. That's overreach. A few people in the audience nodded. Someone in the back even clapped softly before the president quickly asked for order. He continued calmly, I'm not here to argue. I just want to remind everyone that I've always taken care of my part of the lake. I've allowed access for cleanups and for anyone who asks respectfully. I believe in community, but I also believe in fairness. If this policy passes, it would take away private rights, and that would set a bad example for all of us. The board exchanged nervous looks. They clearly hadn't expected him to show up prepared. The discussion dragged on for another 20 minutes, with some neighbors speaking up in his defense. They pointed out that he had always been cooperative and generous with his lake access. Finally, the motion to change the policy was dropped. The president sighed, thanked everyone for attending, and quickly ended the meeting. As people started leaving, a few neighbors came up to him, shaking his hand and thanking him for standing up. You did the right thing, one of them said. This neighborhood needs people like you to keep them honest. He smiled humbly. I'm just trying to live in peace like everyone else. Outside, the evening sky was streaked with pink and gold. The air was cool, and he took a slow walk back home, feeling both tired and satisfied. It wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about standing quietly for what was fair. A few days later, something unexpected happened. The same HOA president who had given him so much trouble came to his door. She looked different this time, not defensive or proud, just human. I wanted to apologize, she said softly. I think things got out of hand. We should have handled it better. He didn't gloat or make her feel worse. He just nodded. Apology accepted. It's all behind us now, she smiled faintly. Thank you. By the way, the board is planning to hold a fishing day for local families next month. We'd love to use the lake again if you're okay with it. He paused, then smiled. Of course. Just let me know the date. I'll even help set up. That moment marked a quiet change. The tension that had once filled the air between him and the HOA finally faded. When the fishing day arrived, the neighborhood gathered again by the lake. Kids ran around laughing, parents chatted while grilling, and people cast their lines into the calm water. He walked along the dock, smiling as he watched everyone enjoy the very lake that had once been the source of all the conflict. Even the HOA board members were there, relaxed for once, no clipboards, no rules being barked out, just people enjoying a sunny day. As the afternoon went on, one of the kids ran up to him, proudly holding up a small fish. I caught one, the boy shouted, grinning from ear to ear. He laughed. That's a good one. Make sure you put it back gently. The boy nodded and carefully released the fish into the water. The ripples spread across the surface, catching the sunlight. For a moment, everything felt perfect, calm, fair, and peaceful. When the event ended, people thanked him again for his kindness. One neighbor said, You know, it's funny. The HOA tried to make things harder for you, and now you're the reason everyone's smiling out here. He chuckled softly. Life's strange that way. Sometimes standing your ground quietly ends up changing more than you expect. That night he sat on his porch, watching the moonlight dance on the lake. The same lake that had once been a battlefield was now the heart of the neighborhood. He leaned back, took a deep breath, and smiled. Peace had returned, not because he fought harder, but because he stayed calm, stood firm, and let time prove him right. And as the sound of the water filled the night air, he realized something simple yet powerful. Sometimes, doing what's right doesn't just protect your space, it inspires others to do the same.